The hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound in the car, a low, steady drone that seemed to amplify the silence between my father and me. I was 16, and the space between the passenger seat and the driver's seat felt like a canyon, carved out by years of unspoken words, misunderstood intentions, and the simple, brutal fact that we were fundamentally different creatures. My father, David, was a man of quiet routine, a structural engineer who saw the world in lines, loads, and unwavering logic. I was a cloud of teenage angst and artistic yearning, my world a swirl of emotions, guitar chords, and poetry that he could never seem to decipher. This particular silence, on a random Tuesday evening, was heavier than most. It was weighted with the fallout from a decision I'd made, or more accurately, a decision I'd failed to make. I had been accepted into a prestigious, month-long summer art program. It was my dream, a chance to be surrounded by people who spoke the same cryptic, emotional language I did. But it cost money, a lot of it, money that I knew my parents had been carefully setting aside for a family vacation. When the acceptance letter came, my mother, Susan, had beamed with a pride I desperately craved from my father. He had simply looked at the brochure, noted the tuition fee, and said, "We'll have to see, Michael. The cabin in Colorado is already booked." That was it. No excitement, no congratulations, just a logistical problem. To me, it was a rejection of who I was. The ensuing weeks were a Cold War fought over dinner tables and in past notes from my mother, trying to broker a peace I didn't think was possible. So, on this car ride, the air was thick with my resentment and his stoic disappointment. He was driving me to my part-time job at a local grocery store, a job he saw as building character and I saw as a soul-crushing necessity. We were about 5 minutes from the store when his phone rang, cutting through the silence like a shard of glass. He glanced at it, his brow furrowing slightly, a rare crack in his composed facade. "Yeah, John," he answered, his voice its usual calm baritone. I stared out the window, watching identical suburban houses blur into a streak of beige and green. But then his voice changed. "What do you mean, collapsed? Is everyone okay?" The east support beam. Jesus. I turned to look at him. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw tight. He was silent for a long moment, listening. No, I'm on my way. Tell them to cordon off the entire site. Don't let anyone near it. I'll be there in 20. He ended the call and let out a long, slow breath. A construction site he was overseeing, a new community center he'd been pouring his heart into for months, had suffered a partial collapse. No one was hurt, thank God, but it was a disaster. A professional, personal, and very public failure for a man whose entire identity was built on things not falling down. He pulled into the grocery store parking lot and stopped the car. He didn't put it in park immediately, just sat there, his hands still gripping the wheel, staring straight ahead at the glowing red logo of the store. I unbuckled my seatbelt, the click echoing in the tense space. I was ready to bolt, to escape into the fluorescent-lit monotony of stacking soup cans, leaving him and his problems behind. But then he did something he never did. He turned to me. His eyes, usually the cool, assessing gray of polished steel, were clouded with something I rarely saw, vulnerability. "Michael," he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I have to go. This is bad. But your shift, your manager." I shrugged, a practiced, nonchalant gesture. "It's fine, I'll just call in." "No," he said, and the word was firm, but not with its usual authority. It was almost pleading. "I need you to come with me." The request hung in the air, so utterly bizarre and out of character that I couldn't process it. Come with him, to a crisis at a construction site. What could I, his flaky, guitar-strumming son, possibly do there? I was the problem, not the solution. I was the emotional variable in his otherwise perfectly calculated life. "Dad, I have to work." And what would I even do there? He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw past the engineer, past the disciplinarian, and saw just a man, tired and facing a storm. "I don't know," he admitted, a shocking confession from a man who always had a plan. "But I'd like you there." That was the moment, the pivot point, the one choice. On my side, I had a choice. To cling to my anger, to see this as an inconvenience, to retreat into the sullen safety of my own world. Or I could step into his. For a reason I still don't fully understand, something in his tone, the raw, unvarnished need in it, cut through all my defenses. I nodded slowly. "Okay," I said, "let me call Brenda and tell her I have a family emergency." A flicker of something, relief, gratitude, passed over his face. He just nodded, put the car in drive, and we pulled out of the parking lot, heading not towards the mundane, but directly into the heart of his catastrophe. The drive to the site was silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer a wall, it was a shared, charged space. He drove faster than usual, his focus absolute. When we arrived, the scene was chaos, lit by the harsh, blue-white glare of emergency floodlights. Police cruisers had cordoned off the street, their lights painting the gathering dusk in swirling red and blue. The skeleton of the community center stood against the bruised purple sky, and it was immediately obvious what had happened. A large section of the roof had given way, dragging a portion of an upper wall with it, leaving a gaping, jagged wound in the structure. Reporters were already gathering, held back by tape. I saw my father's foreman, John, a burly man with a face like a clenched fist, rush over to us. "David, thank God," John said, his voice strained. "The inspector is here, and he's talking about full shutdown, possible negligence." My father didn't flinch. He had transformed. The vulnerability I'd seen in the car was gone, replaced by a calm, commanding presence. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise. As he strode toward a cluster of men in hard hats and suits, I trailed behind, feeling utterly useless and out of place in my jeans and hoodie. I was a ghost in his world of concrete and steel. I stood to the side, watching as he engaged with the city inspector, a man with a clipboard and a permanently skeptical expression. My father didn't make excuses. He didn't blame the crew or the suppliers. He listened, his head bowed slightly, absorbing every accusation and concern. Then, he began to speak. He didn't talk about fault, he talked about physics. He explained the load-bearing calculations, the stress points, the specific batch of steel that had been delivered, and how its tensile strength had been verified. He spoke a language I didn't understand, a lexicon of yield strength and shear forces, but I understood the cadence. It was the rhythm of absolute competence. He asked John for the original blueprints, which were brought over, large sheets of paper that flapped in the evening breeze. He spread them on the hood of his truck, anchoring the corners with coffee cups and wrenches. And then, he did the thing that would change everything. He looked up from the schematics, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene, and they landed on me. "Michael," he called out. "Can you come here for a second?" I walked over, my heart thudding strangely. The inspector and the other men looked at me, this scrawny teenager, with curiosity. "I need another set of eyes," my father said, and he wasn't patronizing. He was sincere. He pointed to a complex web of lines on the blueprint. "This is the truss system for the collapsed section. I need you to hold this corner flat. The wind is making it impossible to see." It was a simple, menial task. But it wasn't the task that mattered. It was the invitation. He was inviting me into the sanctum of his work, into the very heart of the crisis. I moved to the hood of the truck, placing my hands on the corners of the large, daunting sheet of paper, pressing it down against the metal. I was helping. In however small a way, I was part of the solution. For the next hour, I stood there as my father, John, and the inspector pored over the plans. My father would point to something, explain it in his technical language, and then, almost as an afterthought, he would translate it for me. "You see this, Michael?" he'd say, his finger tracing a line. "This beam is supposed to transfer the load here. But if the connection isn't perfect, if even one bolt is over-torqued, it creates a microscopic fracture. Over time, with stress, that fracture grows. It's not about a single mistake. It's about a chain of tiny, invisible failures that finally reach a breaking point." As he said this, his eyes met mine, and a jolt went through me. He wasn't just talking about steel and concrete anymore. He was talking about us. The missed baseball games he'd chalked up to work deadlines, the poems I'd written that he'd praised but hadn't seemed to truly see, the quiet dinners where we'd spoken about everything and nothing at all. Our own bond had been suffering from a chain of tiny, invisible failures. And tonight, it had nearly collapsed. The investigation stretched on. I eventually let go of the blueprints when the wind died down, but I didn't retreat to the sidelines. I fetched coffee. I held a flashlight as they peered into the damaged section. I listened. And I watched my father. I saw the immense weight of responsibility on his shoulders, not just for the project, but for the safety of his crew, for the reputation of his small firm, for the community that was counting on this center. This wasn't just a job to him, it was his craft, his art. The precision and care he applied to his work was a form of poetry I was only just beginning to understand. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the inspector nodded, closed his notebook, and shook my father's hand. It looks like a material defect in the beam, David. Not a design flaw. We'll need a full metallurgical report, but your schematics are sound. You did everything by the book. The relief that washed over my father's face was profound. The professional crisis was averted. The men dispersed, the reporters lost interest, and the site grew quieter, lit only by the lonely floodlights. It was just the two of us again, standing in the wreckage. He walked over to me, his shoulders slumping with a fatigue I now understood was more than physical. "Thank you, Michael," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "For what?" I just held some paper. "No," he said, shaking his head. "For being here. I didn't want to be alone with this." In that simple admission, the last of my teenage resentment crumbled. All my life, I had seen his quietness as distance, his logic as coldness. I had interpreted his failure to cheer at my art shows as a failure to love the artist. But standing there in the cold night air, surrounded by the tangible evidence of his own world falling apart, I realized I had been reading him all wrong. His love wasn't a loud, booming emotion. It was a silent, load-bearing structure. It was in the roof over our head, the food on our table, the college fund he meticulously added to every month. It was in the steadfast, reliable presence that I had always taken for granted because it had never, ever wavered. He showed his love by building a world that wouldn't collapse around me, and I had been too busy complaining about the architecture to see the strength of the foundation. The drive home was quiet again, but this time the silence was comfortable, a shared space of mutual exhaustion and newfound understanding. When we pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the porch light, left on by my mother. He turned off the engine but didn't get out immediately. We sat in the dark car, the ticking of the cooling engine the only sound. "About that art program," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. My heart sank. Here it was. The pragmatic reality. The money was gone, spent on this disaster. The dream was over. "Yeah," I said, my voice flat. He turned to me. "We'll make it work. We'll figure out the money. You should go." I was stunned. "But the vacation, the cabin." "Your mother and I can take a vacation anytime," he said. "What you have, that talent, it's important. It needs to be nurtured. I may not always understand it, Michael, but I see it. And I'm proud of you." He had never said that before. Not like that, not with such direct, unqualified clarity. The words hung in the dark car, more solid and real than any steel beam. That night was the true beginning of our relationship. The choice he made in that grocery store parking lot, to ask for my help, to let me see his vulnerability, and the choice I made to give it, dismantled the wall between us. We didn't suddenly become best friends. He didn't start quoting poetry, and I didn't develop a sudden passion for differential equations. But we found a new language. I started asking him about his projects, not as a duty, but with genuine curiosity. He would explain the engineering challenges, and I'd marvel at the creativity involved in solving them. It was his form of art. And he, in turn, started asking about my music. He'd sit in the living room and actually listen while I practiced, and though his feedback was still practical, "That second chord sounds a bit sadder than the first, is that on purpose?" It was engaged. He was trying to learn my language, just as I was learning his. I did go to that art program that summer. And when I came back, buzzing with new ideas and techniques, he was the first one to ask to see my sketchbook. He paged through it slowly, carefully, and when he came to a drawing I'd done of a bridge, he stopped. "This is good, Michael," he said, tracing the line of the suspension cable with his finger. "The perspective here is very strong. It feels stable." It was the highest compliment he could have given. Years have passed since that night. I became a graphic designer, a career that sits in a fascinating space between his world of structure and my world of art. We talk almost every day. We collaborate on projects. I design the logos and branding for his firm. He advises me on the structural integrity of a large installation piece I'm working on. We've built a bond that is, in his words, over-engineered, designed to withstand any load. People often talk about pivotal moments involving grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements. For my father and me, it was the opposite. It was a quiet request in a parked car. A choice to let someone in when every instinct must have been telling him to shut the world out and handle his failure alone. He chose to be vulnerable with me. He chose to show me that even the strongest structures can falter, and that true strength isn't about never failing, it's about having the courage to diagnose the fracture and rebuild, stronger and smarter than before. That one choice, to say, "I need you there," didn't just change our relationship, it defined it. It taught me that love isn't always about loud proclamations. Sometimes, it's the silent, steadfast work of holding up the blueprint in the wind, of being a witness to someone's struggle, and of building a connection, beam by careful beam, that can hold the weight of everything that truly matters. He is my father, David, the engineer. And I am his son, Michael, the artist. And the bridge we built between our two worlds is the strongest structure I will ever know.